Good morning. This is Kenneth and Heather with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to give you our recap of last night's Minneapolis Committee of the Whole meeting, where they primarily talked about academics. Who would have thought they were going to talk about academics? I'm so excited. That's the nerd in me. But Heather, how are you doing before we get into
Good. I mean, it was a very different feeling of a meeting. Let's just say that.
yeah, it was and I have a lot of feelings about that. But why don't you know, why don't you give us the rundown of what happened last night? But before we get into that, I did actually want to just, take a moment to recognize a couple of different things that have been going on. Obviously, last night before the meeting took place, we all heard news about the mass shooting in Texas at an elementary school. And so just really, really concerned about the state of our world, the state of our country, with another mass shooting. Um, and this one, obviously, targeting children and schools is horrifying and obviously very close to the work that we do. So I don't know. We desperately need to see change in these areas. And then also over the weekend, we know that Minneapolis public schools and went through a lot, especially North High, with you know Principal Friesleben leaving, whether she was resigned or asked to leave last Friday, and then was reinstated and asked to come back on Monday. Just a lot going on in our Minneapolis community, and obviously in education in our country. So didn't want to go by without recognizing that. So yeah, just wanted to give space to that. But Heather, with that, do you want to go ahead and talk about last night's board meeting?
Yeah, so last night the board welcomed our new board member, Cynthia Booker, who was there from now until the November election. So that was exciting. And then, yeah, like you said, last night was an academic update where this year we were able to give more screeners and the MCA test and things that students necessarily we weren't able to manage during distance learning in the pandemic. Um, we heard from the academic team, we heard from the REA team, and we got to hear from principals and teachers from Nellie Stone, from Jenny Lind, from Pillsbury, and from Bryn Mawr. And so we got to hear a lot about academics, a little bit about math, and we got
But
to hear
mostly about
from.
literacy and how like some of the literacy training and partnerships are going. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about it. Let's get into it. What was the slide of the night for you, Kenneth?
Yeah, my slide of the night, um, it's hard, but my slide of the night was this on track data. And so, this on track data mainly captures the on track data for students in ninth grade. Um, and last night, what we heard from Minneapolis Public Schools is that overall the data is flat around academic growth. And I'm just, this is not great news because we know what flat really means is there are really huge disparities. And outside of even the disparities, when we're looking at some of these numbers, right, seeing that only a quarter of our Black or African American students are on track for graduation after the second quarter of ninth grade, like that's really, really scary. Seeing only 33% of our EL students being on track is really scary. 16% of our American Indian students, right? And so when we talk about flat, I don't want it to get lost because that was the messaging of the district yesterday, is that we were flat. And I don't want it to get lost that like flat is actually really, really bad, despite everything that went on during the pandemic. We aren't in a good place, especially for our students of color and Indigenous students, who, by the way, again, make up a majority of our district. And so I did want to just point that out. There were several things last night that were um, interesting, and I think could can produce hope, especially hearing from the different school communities and school leaders around the direction around some of the literacy work taking place across the district, the potential of implementing a math curriculum soon is really big news and exciting. But I do want us to be grounded in where we're starting from and the work that we have to do.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that happened last night was that we heard from these schools, and we heard um, different schools using different literacy tools. It sounded like predominantly in their K2. So these are schools who are trying new programming or new training or new interventions, and there were a couple of like acronyms or programs that we heard tossed around a lot. I think it was great to hear from teachers and from principals about what they were excited about, like what was working. And we even heard one teacher say, "I can't wait to hit the ground running next year because I know that these students are learning, and I know that what I'm going to teach them is going to help them to learn to read." And I was like, wow, that was so amazing to hear. Um, but I didn't necessarily, like, if you weren't listening to these things or you weren't listening to the literacy conversation that's been going on, it was a little confusing to understand, like, why do some schools have this thing called letters? Why do some schools use press? What is letters? What is press? What is groves? And so hopefully at another meeting we'll be able to learn a little bit more about each one of these things. And then also, like, kind of along your line, like, while it was exciting to hear about this, one of the things I was wondering is, like, why are we using these things in some schools and not all schools? And then why are we using interventions when, like, why do we need so much intervention? And so I think these are just what I heard last night was some honest answers about these are some of the questions that our academic team is struggling with and working on and trying to understand. And so yeah, I mean, I think it was really fun to and interesting and illuminating.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was, we have, a couple of different things happening across the district when it comes to literacy, especially. And I think it was important to hear about those things. I think as somebody I would venture that board also doesn't even know, but as somebody who doesn't know, what is the exact difference between Groves, the partnership with Groves Academy versus some of the press professional development that's taking place versus the grant that some teachers are opting into with letters training, right? Like, what is the difference? But I would say the one thing that we did hear pretty solidly for those literacy nerds out there is that the district is embracing the science of reading and is definitely moving in that direction. And so, I think that is something to acknowledge and maybe be excited about, because I think that is the district finally embracing a direction and now starting to figure out what tools they'll use and what PD and training is necessary for teachers to be able to work under that vision, that philosophy. So I think that's positive. And so with that, Heather, let's go into our most valuable moment and our do better moment. And so do you want to kick us off with your let's start with our do better moment. Let's start with our do better moment.
Okay, so for me, my do better moment was that, like, I still see a real discrepancy between the fact that graduation rates are going up while reading is staying flat or going down. And so what that tells me is that, like, maybe we're graduating more students, but I don't know if we're asking ourselves the question of, like, what is a graduation? What is a certificate? What does that mean? What do we as a district want that to represent? Is it that students showed up enough days, enough times, or is it that like a degree means that you are leaving Minneapolis Public Schools with all of the skills that you need in order to live the life that you want, right? And so I do think it's, like, easy to celebrate graduation rates, but there was another set of data underneath there with math and literacy that leads me to believe that, like, we maybe aren't giving those kiddos what they need. And so yeah, that was my do better moment.
Yeah. Well, my do better, I agree with you, Heather, and it's something that's irked me for a long time is to see our graduation rates go up while our literacy rates, our math rates, our on track data goes in the opposite direction. So yeah, I appreciate you for bringing that up. My do better moment was, thinking about what 2022 has been. I had a moment in that boardroom last night where, we're hearing from these different school leaders about things that they're excited about, that they're trying, partnerships that are happening, how that could potentially be scaled up and across the district with what they're doing with literacy in their buildings. Having this really important conversation about the academic outcomes that we're currently seeing. And all of a sudden being hit with, there are only 6 of us in this room today. Heather, I know you were watching remotely. And so I know that other people might have been watching remotely, but given all the school board meetings that have taken place over the last several months, and how much energy, how much frustration, passion came into those boardrooms, given a different, whether, whatever the issue was, whether it was around the strike agreement, whether it was the back to work agreement, whether it's been the budget, right? Like boardrooms packed, all this stuff. And then when we finally get an opportunity, when we finally have a scheduled opportunity to focus on academics, to talk about the disparities that we have, to talk about the direction we're going academically for this academic institution, it was quiet. Social media was a lot quieter. Boardroom was, there were 6 community members, non-staff members outside of the media that were there. The boardroom was quiet. And I just, this was, in my opinion, the most important conversation that we have had this year. Like, this was it. This was the most important conversation that the board has had this year. And like, for all those people that, said that they were, they're committed to education and all, we're there and we're in it and wanted to see all these changes, last night was an opportunity to talk about it. But I'm concerned that we are more committed to the politics of education and not actually the outcomes when it comes to education and what comes for the students of color across our city. And that's my do better moment, is like our city's commitment to the students of our city versus just the politics and the issues of adults across our city. So that's my takeaway. That's my do better moment.
I agree with you on that. Now, back to my most valuable moment.
Yeah, let's end on a high note.
Yeah, let's end on a high note. So, gosh, it was great to hear from principals and teachers. Like, especially to be highlighting racially isolated schools, teachers and principals who are doing the work, who are getting it done despite all the things that we typically point to say, these are the reasons we can't get it done. And they're out there getting it done. I found listening to actual teachers and actual principals a breath of fresh air. I felt like it was inspiring, and now I want to go see those schools. I heard Director Caprini say, this is something I've been asking for since before I was a board member. And so I just want to say, let's see more of that. Let's see more connection between Davis and staff and teachers actually doing the work. It was amazing.
I agree. And again, I think, not to harp on my do better moment, but I just think that's part of the reason why I'm just so frustrated with the conversation that we choose to have around education, because if you wanted to see and hear directly from how the board hears from principals and teachers, like, that was it. That was a space to do it. That was a great opportunity to hear, like, this is the type of feedback. This is how the board is getting input and hearing about what's going on and how the district and administration is partnering with schools to identify that. So again, anyway, not to harp on my do better moment, because we're ending on a good note. So we're ending with my most valuable moment, which goes to student representative rants. I think it's a little known secret in Minneapolis that our high school students don't really have a metric around like growth. We don't have a way to measure what students are getting out of high school in Minneapolis public schools outside of credits, attaining credits.
And then that and then that SAT, right? Like that ultimate. So there's no way to say, like, are we ready for that SAT?
Right. And we don't understand like the growth that is happening, right?
Yeah.
We understand that this is, there's a lot of debates that go between growth versus proficiency and all that stuff. We don't understand the type of growth that's happening in high school. And so Student Representative Rance asked a great question last night that said, we see this ninth grade on track data that I use as my slide of the night, but that's ninth grade. What's happening in 10th grade? What's happening in 11th grade? Like, do we know? There's no data. We just know like what 12th graders are graduating, if ninth graders are on track or not. And we don't, there's like 2 years in the middle that seem really important. Um, but we have some MCA data for those students, but again, it's not really talked about, it's not really reported on. And we also heard last night that high school students, there's a big dip when it comes to taking the MCAs. And so I just think that I really appreciate Student Representative Rant's devotion and at least curiosity. I shouldn't say devotion. I don't want to put that on her, but curiosity into understanding how some of her other colleagues, her peers in school are doing, and wanting to see data associated with that, which led to, airing out an important little nugget of information that there isn't really a system for us to measure high school growth right now in Minneapolis and high school achievement. I think that's important to recognize.
Yeah, it was a great it was it was a good meeting full of good information and clear answers and new faces. That was my overall takeaway. Work to be done, work happening, but at least I don't know. It was a for me it was one of the more clear board meetings I've attended in a while. So
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And thanks for recording with me, Heather.
bye.